you're looking at roughly a year's worth of food right there for a family of 2 adults and 1 small child. So about once a year, you should survey your stash of preps. And as you can see here, I've got my wall of these food bricks set up. I have roughly 60 food bricks and roughly 20 or so water bricks. And I've numbered them all. And these correspond to various entries in my Excel where I store my food items. And you want to check on them. For example, let's check out this garbanzo. That is a bad sign. It has lost its tightness or its vacuum. It looks like it might be a prep failure. Whereas now if I take a look at this green lentils, I can see that the bag still is kind of clinging to the lentils. So it's more likely that the vacuum and the oxygen remover is still good. And here, this is an example. This is a good vacuum seal. So I'm suspicious that my garbanzos might have lost their vacuum integrity, whereas my black beans I know are still good because that bag, the Mylar bag, still looks like it's under vacuum. The oxygen absorber is still, at the least, removing any oxygen that's diffusing in.
And here's my actual Excel, or well, technically it's numbers, but it's the same thing, showing my approximate stash in the food bricks. I've got the food brick number, which is labeled with the Sharpie on the leftmost column, which you can partly see. Then in the item, I put the text for the name of the item, and then I list the various specifications. I also have like a decay rate for each item. That is how many years I expect it to last. Like sugar and salt, I have it listed as 1, which is 50 years, down to yeast, which is number 6, which lasts only 1 year. That's kind of, I expect its half-life to be, if you want to say that. So each one of my items gets that, as well as how many pounds it is, what date I've inspected it, and approximately how much I paid for it. And that's important because then you want to figure out how much you need to spend per year to maintain your stash. So depending on the decay rates, the cost per year, I mean, if I change my decay rates, like here, instead of paying number 2 is 10, I make it 20, and number 3, which I consider brown rice, I make, instead of 5 years, I make it 10 years. I can change the amount I spend per year to maintain my stash. This is important because your long-term storage will be decaying. And if you want to have some glorious stash, you need to understand that it corresponds to a certain dollar rate of spending money just to maintain your stash. So you need to have an Excel to hold all your information and also figure out how much you're spending on your preps. Now, to make it easier, I've taken some screenshots of representative screens from my spreadsheet. So I got the food brick, the number of the food brick, the item, the inspection date, like if there's like packages, like tuna cans and how many pounds per package inside it, or I just type in the gross weight. So green means it's been calculated. White or pink means it's been typed in. And so once I know like how much I paid for it, then I know roughly how much I'm spending on, like how much I spent on all my preps. And then based on what I consider the decay rates, then I can figure out how much I have to spend to maintain my preps at its current status. And you're going to find that you're going to spend between $200 and $400 a year to maintain 1 year of food. I mean, that's just that's a long-term storage. You have to remember that long-term storage is not for eating. It's not for rotation. So you're not going to like take cans and rotate them through a pantry when you're doing long-term storage. And also, long-term storage food is not necessarily the tastiest stuff that you want. I mean, it's not, you don't want to like organize your life around it. So you're most likely just going to let it sit and decay for 10 years rather than just rotating through it.
Now I also have some additional food stash, which I don't count on, so I don't really count it. For example, I've got a bunch of like cornstarch and powdered milk and things like that, but I don't count that because it's not in my food bricks. And I also have some of these Home Depot buckets, and I have some Mylar bags in them. Again, don't count on those. Those are kind of my second tier preps. And I've got a small amount of gasoline here. But I've also put some water bricks. I keep them down at the bottom. The ones that are full of water are in the bottom because they're very heavy. And the ones here, these are actually empty, but I need them for horizontal stabilization because I've stacked these quite high. So these are like 8 tall, and it's a little bit wobbly. But if you add, since these stack like Legos, you put a couple of these horizontally that are filled with like pet food or just empty, and that allows you to stack them even higher. When you stack them high, you want to make sure that you also want to make sure that the apertures are all out and accessible. Otherwise, you won't be able to survey them or check to see what their status is. And here, it's on the end, but it's okay because I've made it so you can still get to the front. So all of your food bricks should have their apertures accessible. And the stacking should not be too high unless you intermittently use these horizontal braces. I'm not actually sure if I could stack them even higher than this. So 8 seems to be a good sweet spot. I can probably stack them much higher. They're spec'd to something like 8 or 6 or something, but it doesn't matter. You can actually stack them much higher than that. Each one can carry roughly 10 pounds of rice or beans, although you can pack almost up to 15 pounds. But the practical limit is closer to 10 pounds. If you use 1 gallon Mylar bags, you can put 2 of them in there. You can almost fit 3, but not quite. So that's where like the 10 to 15 pounds comes from. Now you can see that some of these are not actually filled with Mylar. I've got some canned foods. So I'm thinking of retiring my canned foods from the food bricks. And because those tend to not last as long, they only last like 2 or 3 years before they expire, maybe only 1 or 2 years, depending on what it is. So the food bricks are really, I'm holding these for my ultra long duration storage. That is something where I can buy it once and hopefully have it for 10 years or so. And so the cans don't really work for that. So I'm thinking of possibly taking them out and not putting cans. Only Mylar dried goods like beans and rice, which are the most cost effective, and only using those in the food bricks. For food, I would say go for 6 months to a year. For water, although I have some water bricks stored, and I have maybe a week of water for the family, water is just not very easy to store in this way. And if you do, there's like some limits on how much you can stack them. But if you do use them water bricks, just make sure you stack them on the bottom like this, because they are heavy. So do your annual survey. Now would be a good time, and check on the status of your Mylar to make sure that it's still good. If you're starting to see the bag sag, then you might have a case of Mylar failure. There might be a micro puncture, or the seal might not have been as good, or the oxygen remover was not able to keep up with the constant slow leak of oxygen through the Mylar. Even if you use a really thick Mylar bag, that can happen. So check and refresh Mylar and deoxygenators, or just trash a container and buy a new one, just to make sure.
This is an example of a Mylar success. So this is about roughly 1.5 to 2 years old, it's still rock hard and it's still kind of vacuum sucked in. Don't listen to any prepper, no matter how famous they are, that claims that it's okay for the bag to be loose and soggy. That is not okay. It must be rock hard and tight. Otherwise, there's no way for you to know if the oxygen remover has stopped functioning and the oxygen leakage in through the Mylar has failed. And this is really thick Mylar. It's metallized. It still leaks oxygen, and it leaks oxygen at a significant rate. So you need to check on it every once in every few years. And if it's not rock hard, it's not working. This is an example of a Mylar failure. It's kind of soggy, and I mean, it's still partly sucked in, but it's kind of soggy. This is about 1.5 to 2 years old. But the problem is there's no way to know when it fails. At some point, there's going to be plenty of oxygen in the Mylar, and it'll be possible for various decay processes to activate, possibly hatching of various larvae or dormant, or like some sort of dormant eggs or spores or whatnot is going to be in there. Fungus will start eating the beans or whatever else you have stored, etc. So no, you can't do that. Also, there's a whole bunch of stories and theories about what is and is not safe to store in aluminized Mylar or metallized Mylar. And some people have kind of misinformation that claims that brown rice is no good, or this is no good, or that is no good. But for example, brown rice is just fine, just like white rice. It's sure the oils, the olefins will go rancid on the surface of the brown rice after a couple of years, even if it's in a aluminized Mylar with oxygen removal. But that doesn't matter. It's still perfectly edible. And you still get the calorie content from the starch from the rice. It's just like eating white rice at that point. It's just the olefin oils that make the outer shell giving it partly its color. Those will spoil and go rancid, but it doesn't matter. It's still nutritious and still good. So no, brown rice is not unsafe to store indefinitely in Mylar. So what is unknown are the absolute shelf stability of foods. In spite of MREs being spec'd for 20 years or whatnot, and they are, parts of the MRE may be good for much longer than that. Parts of it may fail earlier, depending on temperature conditions and other things. But the answer is people really actually don't know what the shelf life and shelf stability of various things are, except a few things are absolute. Sugar and salt are absolutely stable. They will stay good for 100,000 years. Just as long as you just don't get any moisture in there, then it's a different story. Just as long as they're dry, they will never spoil because they are simple chemical compounds. There's nothing to spoil. Now, flour is known to spoil because flour tends to have little weevil eggs in it. So if you were to have a bag of flour and then 10 years later open it up, you will find a bunch of kind of little probably dead maggots in it, or dried up worms and whatnot. They hatched, ate a bunch of flour, pooped around the place, and eventually died. And so your flour probably went bad, or at least got some worms in it. But it didn't come in from the outside. It actually came from inside the flour itself. So that's why you deoxygenate and vacuum seal in Mylar. But again, no one actually knows how long flour would really last if you do that. In theory, maybe it's stable almost forever. So I have just arbitrarily made up 20 as the number of years it'll stay good, but maybe it's only 10. I mean, we don't really know. Now, the explanation that a lot of people give for why brown rice is no good compared to white rice is that supposedly the oils and the olefins go rancid. Okay, whoop-de-doo, it doesn't matter. It doesn't spoil its food quality. It's still food. As long as you don't care about some little taste, it doesn't make any difference. Brown rice is just fine. It will not become poisonous or anything like that. so it's okay to store in Mylar. Now, the only reason I go for brown rice instead of white rice is because brown rice has more nutrients in it as a baseline, and also because it metabolizes slower than white rice. It is less likely to give you diabetes in the long run. So brown rice, better for you health-wise, and probably lasts fairly well. Maybe it's not as long as white rice, although it probably is still just as good. So I'm going to just say it's only maybe 10 years or 5 years for brown rice in Mylar, but that's just made up. Nobody really knows. Now, dried fruits are a special case and also can be dangerous because whether or not certain deadly bacteria can survive in an oxygen-free environment and actually thrive is strongly dependent on the details of the pH and the moisture content. So dried fruit is dangerous, and you may not want to risk it, especially dried apricots. Many fruits are dangerous when dried, especially if you keep them in an oxygen-free environment. So again, very sensitive to pH. Even if you have some, for example, dried apricots from one brand, they might be safe and shelf stable in a deoxygenated environment, but another nearly identical dried apricots would be poisonous because their pH was slightly higher, and therefore they allowed the dangerous bacteria to replicate and grow. Maybe their moisture content was a little too high too, or whatnot, so it's kind of tricky. It might not be safe to store dried fruit in any capacity in an oxygen-free environment, but possibly with a desiccator instead. Again, this is now sort of in the unknown and possibly dangerous regime, so you may want to stay away from dried fruit and just stick to the relatively safe rice and beans. Or if you're contemplating apocalyptic marauder scenarios, perhaps you can have some prisoners that have to test your dried fruit, and if they survive, then they're good to eat. Then we have the canned meats, jarred peanut butter and jelly. These also unclear how well these are going to store. I consider these have a 2-year-ish half-life, so I don't trust these. That's also why I'm contemplating removing them out of my long-term stash and not wasting FOODBRICKs on them, focusing FOODBRICKs only on brown rice, beans, things like that. Then there's the things like yeasts and dried yogurt starter cultures that you're trying to preserve. Those have a fairly short half-life of about a year, and those are probably better to keep in your freezers. And freezers are things that you would have to run off your long-term solar system and kind of keep them. If you keep them frozen, I think they may stay good for 10 years or so. I have left out the category called medications, but you can treat that sort of as yeast, in that if you keep it in your solar-powered off-grid freezers, then that lasts as long as your freezer continues to function. But if it's stored at room temperature-ish type conditions, then it may only stay good for about a year or so, sort of like yeast. Except I have seen some papers with some military studies where various meds like metoprolol actually were still good even many years after their expiration date, like even 5 years past their expiration date. Spectroscopically, the chemical signature of metoprolol was fully intact. So it's possible that even if it claims it expires after a year, it may actually be good for 10, 20 years after its expiration.